If any of you know me outside of the context of being an English teacher, you know that I have several interests about which I'm fairly outspoken, and one of these is film, and more specifically, the films of Hayao Miyazaki. Aside from me just being a big fan of his films, it's pretty well documented that apart from Walt Disney, he has probably had the biggest impact on modern animation as any other filmmaker. In fact, it was the Disney company that recognized this and actually decided to release his films in America. And he's often recognized to be the creator of films that have actually influenced what has come out of Disney and Pixar in recent years. I bring this up as an analogy. Miyazaki's films are to Pixar and Disney films what William Shakespeare is to modern storytelling and what he is to the English language. We wouldn't have the same story structures or character tropes or genres or even styles of humor and pathos that we have today if it weren't for Shakespeare. And that's why we're going to spend this time looking at his work. He's the single most influential figure on how we tell and hear stories today. And he very well could be considered the father of modern English. A lot of the ways in which you speak have been directly influenced by the way Shakespeare wrote. The first point about Shakespeare that I want to make is that he didn't invent the idea of having compelling characters or the ideas of genres like comedies and tragedies, but he did allow these stories and types of stories to be told in a more authentic way. What I mean is that he made these stories compelling by allowing characters to drive the plot rather than repetition in the narrative. Thanks to Shakespeare, we care more now about how characters act and carry themselves regardless of what the author wants us to think about them. Shakespeare allows us to be modern critics of the characters in the narrative. He doesn't trap us into an idea that some characters must be viewed through a certain lens or any preconceived notions. Some people consider Romeo and Juliet, for instance, to be the greatest love story of all time, and some consider it to be a story about spoiled teenagers who couldn't keep it together and most likely didn't love each other at all. You can develop your own opinion on that, but the point is that Shakespeare allowed us to do this. This is just one example of how he brings the viewer or reader into the dialogue of the story. We become critical participants in the narrative, and this has trickled down into how we view characters and stories today. You can have all sorts of opinions on a character's decision-making, their personality, whether they should end up with this guy or this girl, or if you think they are even essential to the story. This is because Shakespeare welcomed us into stories as participants in this new way that informs everything about how we read and view them. In addition to being the author of modern storytelling, he can be considered the founder of the modern way of speaking English. Now, the charge often leveled at Shakespeare is that he has antiquated language that's too hard to understand and that students don't want to read in Old English. I want to put this argument to rest once and for all.
On Yerada, hina God elmeti, dahi walda on galio yistia, modi for alamen, bluja ich ni dorsta, a hof ich rikna kining, hea funes hlafud, halda ich ni dorsta.
As you can tell, Old English is something completely different from what we'll be experiencing in Shakespeare. Shakespeare plays are actually written in modern English. There's nothing old-timey about it. Take this passage from Much Ado About Nothing.
Silence is the perfectest herald of joy. I were but little happy if I could say how much.
These are all words that you have heard before in modern English. The only one you may need to define is herald, which in this case means messenger. The trick is simply interpreting the poetic language. Essentially, if silence heralds joy, this means that the speaker of this quote is happiest when he's silent. And if he was able to put his feelings into words, he would not be as happy as he is when he is speechless. But I think it's clear that the quote itself is a much more interesting way to communicate that concept. There's the metaphor of silence being the herald of a person's feeling of joy. And this is important because so much of Shakespeare's language is wrapped up in these fantastic metaphors. If you recognize this, his writing is much easier to understand. But on point about him being so influential on the language, I do believe he has had an impact on how we use metaphors in daily life and speech, but also check out the list of words that he invented down below. It is estimated that we still use about 1,700 words that he invented or popularized. Every time you speak this language is a small tribute to Shakespeare. So how are we going to be confronting his plays? Even though it's in modern English, it does require some interpretation, and it would be silly for me to ask you to read these plays entirely on your own and understand all of the main points and events. That's why the first step in understanding Shakespeare's stories is to treat them for what they are, plays. These are not books or novels. These are plays. They're meant to be performed and viewed, and we will be doing both in class, acting out scenes, viewing different productions. What I will not be asking you to do is slog through the language on your own and expecting a thorough analysis. In fact, if you don't understand every word, phrase, or metaphor, that's okay. I'm more concerned that you are understanding the relationships between the characters and how the plots are progressing. We'll be discussing the gorgeous language in class and delving a bit more into Shakespeare's writing style, but you should be concerned about understanding the main events and what is going on. If you're doing this, the humor and weight of these stories will come alive for you through the language. When confronting the language of the play with all that in mind, here are a few suggestions for you when listening to it or reading it. All of his characters speak in a very poetic way much of the time to emphasize the clever arrangements of words or references that are made. Something to remember is that sometimes phrases are Yoda'd. When we hear Yoda say something like, "Found someone you have," or "To Obi-Wan you listen," or "When 900 years old you reach, look as good you will not,"
Wars not make one great.
we understand him because of the delivery. This is the same experience that you may have when viewing the play. Putting a different way of organizing the phrase into the mouth of an actor who has researched and reflected over every line will help you to understand it. But when you are reading, consider that a confusing line may be a line that's just kind of in a Yoda style. Here are some examples of that. There are also contractions and abbreviations that Shakespeare likes to use. We do this nowadays in our own way as well. Things like gonna, wanna, my personal favorite, tryna. Folks in Shakespeare's day had their own version of this practice. You've probably heard this before. These are words like tis, which you probably know is an abbreviation for it is, or twas, an abbreviation for it was. But there are some more with which you may be less familiar. These include ope for open, een for even, tain, short for taken, or, short for over, among others. Often, the version of the play that will be handed out to you will have footnotes or a glossary explaining these terms. That's my third suggestion. If you are having trouble with a word or a phrase, check out those resources at the bottom or side of the page. Many times these will not only help explain definitions, but give you a bit of historical context as well, especially when it comes to really unfamiliar phrases. Basically, the publishers and performers of Shakespeare are empathetic to your situation and are taking steps to really help you understand the material. So basically, you have nothing to worry about. You have quite a bit of help at your disposal. And as always, I'm here as a resource for helping to answer specific questions about the material as well. We will be experiencing these plays together both as an audience and as cast members. And if you are fully participating, the text will come alive for you in ways that you didn't think were possible.